Okay, looks like we're good. Okay, great. Okay, good. I think we can give it a whirl. So hello, everybody. Good evening. Nice to see you all. Thanks so much for joining us. I think you all know me, Lucy Helfrich, Director of Program Services for the 300 Committee Land Trust. We're delighted to have you all here, and we're delighted to have Ian Ives here tonight to present Coming Soon to a Neighborhood Near You. I know probably most of you have joined us on Zoom for previous talks, but for anyone who may be new to us, I'd like to say a few words about the 300 Committee, now in our 38th year of preserving open space throughout Falmouth for conservation, animal and bird habitat, recreation, farming, and clean drinking water. To date, we've permanently protected more than 2,500 acres in all of Falmouth's 7 villages, working with town, state, federal, and private partners. And we continue to identify, rank, appraise, negotiate, and contract to acquire high priority lands for permanent protection. We are so grateful to our many members and friends whose support is critical to our work and to our continued success saving important land. Membership support also helps us to manage and steward these conservation lands and to provide a wide variety of outreach and educational programming. Our many open spaces contribute to the natural beauty and quality of life here for all of us. Access to these special places is important, especially during the last 2 very challenging years. The 300 Committee is continuing to work on increasing the attractiveness of and accessibility to open spaces so that we all can enjoy them now and forever. If you are not yet a member, we do hope you will consider joining us, and you can do so by visiting our website, 300committee.org, and joining online. And now a few words about our speaker, Ian Ives. Ian is the director of Mass Audubon's Long Pasture, Ashumet Holly, Barnstable Great Marsh, and Skunknet River wildlife sanctuaries on Cape Cod. His responsibilities include overall management of the sanctuaries and staff, community outreach, advocacy, environmental stewardship, and education. One of his primary goals is to engage the community in Mass Audubon's mission and to expand activities at the wildlife sanctuaries he oversees. He holds a master's degree in conservation biology from Antioch University in New Hampshire. With a strong background in wetland restoration and endangered species management, Ian is leading environmental advocacy and conservation projects across the Cape to help protect rare wildlife and the threatened natural resources they depend on. In his talk tonight, Ian will discuss the local increase in abundance of deer, coyote, fisher, turkey, bobcat, and osprey, and the conflicts, management measures, and ethical considerations that are arising as a result. He will also dispel some of the myths that are out there about living with wildlife, suggesting ways we can effectively coexist. Again, we're thrilled to have Ian with us. Thanks, Ian, for being here. Take it away.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be back too. I wish we could do this in person, everybody. It's great to see all your faces. Oh, hi, Lee. Yeah, it really is. And this is a fun, timely, and current theme. And as Lucy alluded to, with the last 2 years of, in some cases for some of us, having more free time and reestablishing a connection to nature, we've gotten hordes of calls and inquiries from people that, very often haven't had too many opportunities to get outside, but within the last 2 years have discovered nature. And so, we're busy answering calls on our hotlines, directing people to proper sources. And some of the topics we'll talk about tonight are reflections of inquiries we've received. So I think today's presentation will answer a lot of your questions. And it'll raise a lot more questions too, because there's no answers to a lot of the things that we talk about. Some of the topics are controversial. We'll talk about them as well. But a quick pitch, I hope that you have a chance to get out to all of your protected places at 300 Committee lands, all the amazing nooks and crannies of protected land on the Cape. There's so many places. It ceases to amaze me. And at Long Pasture, where I work, we just opened up a new discovery center. I know for many of you are out in outer Mongolia, a whole, 10 miles away in the mid-Cape. But I would encourage you to come out and take a look at our new Discovery Center and our new Discovery Center campus. It's a really spectacular project we just completed, and we're reopening our centers now in the wake, hopeful wake of the pandemic. We'll be doing a lot more indoor programming and hope to see a lot of you there. But there's something to be said about these virtual programs, right? Because you get so many more eyes on them, and you can watch in the leisure of your house. And if you get bored, you can just turn me off. But I promise, Lucy, we'll try to keep this to about 50 minutes so that you have some time for Q&A. I'll try to keep a pace to this. But let's dive in. Coming to a suburb near you, whatever you want to call it. Population trends and impacts. All right, so I figured the fun way to start is to get the juices flowing. I'm going to throw out a couple statements here. This is normally an interactive thing where I can get your feedback. So I'll pause in between each statement, let you guys have a chance to think about these before I answer them. So here's the first one. Clearing trees from your house will keep bobcats away. You may ask, what in the world? How is this sentence derived? What do you think? Do clearing trees from your house keep wild bobcats away? Well, the answer to this is I was leafing through the Cape Cod Times several years ago, and I found an advertisement from a tree company that had the novel and very creative idea to pose this. Are you worried about bobcats in your yard? Well, if so, you might want to call us to clear your trees away. Clearing trees from your house will not keep bobcats away. I think that's safe to say. Here's another little more serious one. River otters are impacting our water resources as beavers do on Cape Cod. What do you all think about that? Do river otters impact our water resources? A lot of people get confused, as we've learned, between river otters and beaver. River otters aren't felling trees in order to create dams, and river otters aren't having an impact on our water the way beavers do. But I bring this up because it's not out of the realm of possibility that beavers might start to expand their ranges onto the Cape. And maybe someday we will see beavers impacting waterways on the Cape. But here on the Cape, they're not doing that yet. Here's another curious one. Bird feeders indirectly kill raptors. What do you think about that? True or false? Well, the answer is true. And we've learned that many birds are impacted by bird feeders. These birds tend to be raptors, birds like sharp-shinned hawks or Cooper's hawks that are drawn to feeders because they are basically a cafeteria, an easy way for them to get food. Right? Birds like Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks are bird eaters. They get drawn to these feeders. As they leave after picking out on chickadees or what have you, they might accidentally run into vehicles or into glass windows, bay windows. And then they get found by concerned citizens, called into Cape Wildlife or Wildcare. And it's not uncommon for these bird-eating raptors to end up injured and in many cases killed. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't set up bird feeders in our yards out of the potential risk for raptors getting unintentionally killed, but it's something to think about. So I'll pose a couple more questions as we go along. Again, these are questions that we've received over the last several years. And it's good to clarify a lot of the myths and to discuss these things. So let's talk a little bit about dispersal. Why is it that animals are in our neighborhoods now that didn't used to be? Well, there's many different reasons, but let's sort of start with the 101, active versus passive dispersal. We're going to talk about active mostly today, which is in most part due to population pressures, resource competition, habitat quality, and size. And the example of the moose crossing the railroad is a good example of active dispersal. And that's different, very different from passive dispersal, which is, the use of kinetic energy that occurs naturally in the environment, like wind blowing seed pods from milkweed. So we have these two types of dispersal. And what's at play in dispersal? Well, we're seeing it every day, right? We're seeing active dispersal taking place. And that's movement from the birth site to the breeding site and from one breeding site to another. This all leads to range expansion. And one of the classic examples that we're seeing these days, it's talked a lot about, is the range expansion of gray seals. What does that mean to us, to our livelihoods, to our hobbies and interests, and to our safety? So this is really what's at play here when it comes to dispersal. So let's talk about, the evolution of animal dispersal. Why is it that animals move around the way that they do? Well, one way to look at it is all of our seasonal variations may be thought of as annual recapitulations of the glacial and interglacial periods of the past. Think about an animal like a bird that migrates or mammals that move around. Their ancestors that lived up in the northern latitudes were forced down to southern latitudes during glacial periods, right? Because there weren't enough resources available to them. Ice was covering their landscape. So these animals were forced down. And then as the climate warmed, the glaciers ameliorated, these animals moved back up to the northern latitudes where their ancestors were from. So again, you can think of that movement that took place over millennials is very similar to the annual migrations that we see today. And this junco here is a good example of an animal that migrates. This junco is a good example of an animal that relies really heavily on certain resources at a dependable time of year in order to get through its life stages. And so this brings up the whole subject of phenology or phenological impacts that might be caused due to climate change, right? So as our climate starts to shift, it can start to have unanticipated consequences on the timing of lots of natural events, such as the hatch of insects. And in the case of a junco, the junco is timing its migration to coincide with the hatch of a certain insect, a mayfly, for example. And due to climate changes, that insect hasn't hatched yet. Well, that could have pretty significant impacts on that species in general. Another good example would be horseshoe crabs and the red knot. I'm sure many of you heard this story. Red knots are intricately tied to the spawning episodes of horseshoe crabs. These red knots are making their way up from the south on their northern migration. They stop over at key horseshoe crab spawning locations, and they are coinciding their stopover with the huge abundance of horseshoe crab eggs. If for some reason the climate might have an impact on water temperature and impact the ability of horseshoe crabs to arrive and spawn at the perfect time, then that could impact this entire red knot population. So all these little detailed interconnectednesses that you don't really pay attention to are coming to light these days with these phenological impacts. It's very, very interesting. It's something just to keep aware of. And I just throw it and inject it into this slide because it's a good example when people ask, well, what does the hatch of a certain bug really matter? How does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? We often use a somewhat simplified analogy that if you're on an airplane and you lose one rivet in the wing, right, it may not have a huge impact, but if a couple of rivets go, it could have a significant impact. And who wants to be on the airplane that's missing rivets, right? So anyways, let's talk a little bit about some other reasons why animals disperse. We talked about active versus passive dispersal. Animals will disperse also because of they being introduced or non-native, or what we might call invasive species. So this animal here, the mute swan, is a classic example of an introduced animal to North America, introduced back in the late 19th century as an ornament in mansions and estates along the Hudson River. Folks that wanted to have a beautiful, iconic animal would import swans from England or Eurasia. They'd set them free on their grounds. Many times they wouldn't control their ability to fly away. Some of these animals would escape, and then they'd start to disperse into other areas along the Hudson. And before you know it, they start to take over some of the native habitat and native species that they're living with. And a good example would be other waterfowl like Canada geese or others. Mute swans can eat about 8 pounds of aquatic vegetation a day. It's a lot of food. They're extremely aggressive and they're huge. They're the largest flying bird in North America. If you've ever gotten too close to a mute swan nest, you know about it, right? The parents come over and scare you away. They're very, very aggressive. And they do the same thing to other waterfowl. So they've become enough of a management problem that wildlife managers all along the eastern seaboard have adapted policies to, in some cases, control through lethal control, some cases by addling the eggs of nests from these mute swans that renders the eggs unviable. There's active controlled hunting to try to control the populations. And it comes down to an ethical question, of course. We start talking about, are we playing God, choosing amongst species? And it also comes down to prioritizing. And in some cases, it comes down to compromises. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong here. And there's a lot of ethical considerations and a lot of philosophies around this. But these sorts of questions about playing God, so to speak, managing wildlife and picking between, certain species is really front and center now. So I just bring it up with this animal because it's a really good example that most people can relate to. So this is another reason why animals disperse, right? They're introduced. Animals can also disperse because they're looking to expand their fitness. Fitness is a biological, ecological word basically relating to resource availability, right? So something like a red fox, it disperses from its natal area where it was born because it's looking for resources. In this case, maybe some squirrels. Resources can come in the form of habitat, perfect denning site, right? Climate can weigh into an ideal habitat for different species. So they can move because of resources. But then the thing I really want to talk about today in this presentation is the generalists that live amongst us. So a lot of animals disperse because they are what we call adaptable generalists. They have evolved over the generations to be able to adapt to many different circumstances and be able to tolerate a variety of different resources. They depend on, or have the luxury, let's put it this way, they have the luxury to be able to utilize many different types of resources. So these adaptable generalists are in a lot of ways taking advantage of us, whether they are deer browsing in our lawns, whether they're coyotes dumpster diving or eating from our gardens, whether they're turkeys foraging in and around our bird feeders, or owls, for example, utilizing our barns or our garages and so on. A lot of adaptable generalists are the species we see all around us that are taking advantage of us. And that can be contrasted with the specialists. And those specialists are endangered species primarily. Things like piping plovers. We all hear about how specialized piping plovers are, right? You're not going to find a piping plover picking away at your bird feeder. They need very, very specialized habitat and resources that can only be found in certain niches. And that puts them at odds and puts them at a disadvantage to being able to secure good habitat, food, and reproduce successfully. So we're going to talk about these guys. On the left is a barred owl, B-A-R-R-E-D, not barn, but barred. Of course, the eastern coyote down below, and then white-tailed deer. So I kind of touched on it. What's at stake, right? What's at stake with all this distribution that we're seeing and dispersal of animals? Well, what's at stake is that we're living in densely packed neighborhoods, in many cases, suburban environments, in which we're forced to be able to adapt ourselves to living with wildlife. We drive down the road, there might be a risk of hitting a deer. Signs are put up to tell people, don't veer for deer and cause an accident. It's not safe. I throw this in there sort of ironic way in that maybe you shouldn't actually veer for deer because there's too many of them. I'm saying that jokingly. So let's talk a little bit about some of these adaptive generalists, the animals that all of a sudden are all around our landscapes, and we're learning how to deal with as citizens or as land managers, right? Or wildlife managers. So the not so wild turkey. It's a great image of two male turkeys. They have these bright red caruncles that you can see, and that's the easiest way to differentiate the males from the females. The males are strutting around at this time of year, and they're starting to mate up, and you'll see them also getting aggressive. And so the story of the wild turkey, turkeys were hunted in huge numbers in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And by the late 1800s, there were virtually no turkeys in Massachusetts. There were virtually no turkeys all throughout New England. And in response to this, in the mid-1950s, New York began to open up some game farms where they were captive raising wild turkeys, propagating them in essence, and releasing them back into the woods of New York. And that captive propagation process was really successful. Since that time, about 1,400 birds have been translocated throughout New York. And of course, they have been successful at establishing and dispersing and reproducing. 700 of these birds that were raised in New York City were released with mass Fish and Wildlife personnel into the state of Massachusetts and established, quote unquote, a population here in Massachusetts. And today there are about 30,000 turkeys in Massachusetts, and that number could be significantly higher. So many people just didn't realize that turkeys were basically translocated through a head starting operation. And that's what allowed their population to rebound. Today, the habitat in and around our neck of the woods on Cape Cod is ideal for turkeys. It's slowly warming. We've got wonderful oak forests that are ideal for turkeys. Turkeys love open savanna-like oak and hickory forests, and we've got that. So I think it's safe to say we're going to be seeing turkeys expand. And hey, maybe someday, as Ben Franklin predicted, the turkey will be the national bird. This is an image representing the hunts of the past, and you can see how many turkeys are hanging from that branch. There's some coyotes in there too. It was this overabundance of hunting that caused the massive decline in a lot of the species that we see around us today. So another key story is that of the white-tailed deer. And the white-tailed deer alters the composition and the structure of our forests more than any other species in North America. And with the increasing number of suburbs and gardens of Eden, so to speak, that we plant around our homes, we are unintentionally attracting deer into our neighborhoods, much the way we unintentionally attract Cooper's hawks to our feeders. And this unanticipated consequence is a denuding of our understory forests. This is a major deal for understory loving birds, such as brown thrashers and towhees that nest in that understory. The image that you see there is a classic example of what you would expect to see if you went up to Ipswich, Massachusetts, for example, where at our Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary, we have a huge explosion of white-tailed deer that whose population is not being controlled by top predators and is having a devastating impact on our habitat. And it's forcing us as wildlife managers at Mass Audubon to make some difficult decisions about how we respond to this. Do we let the deer population continue to boom and have all these collateral damage, or do we do something about it? So several years ago, there was a proposal within our conservation division at Mass Audubon to do some limited hunting of white-tailed deer on our sanctuaries. You can imagine that might have been, a controversial idea and might have resulted in a lot of discussions from our members and neighbors as to why at a wildlife sanctuary you would be allowing hunting. But again, this comes back to the trade-offs that we're now having to make in wildlife management, understanding that not everything is absolute, and sometimes we have to compromise. Sometimes we have to make decisions on behalf of the greater good that might have a sacrifice on a few individuals. And if we're looking at this as a broad macro view of biological diversity and habitat management, you can make good cases. If you're looking at the individual welfare of animals, it may not be so easy. But this is a huge issue. Time Magazine had a big feature many years ago about this, and the problem has only been exacerbated. They posed the question, why the rules of hunting are about to change. So philosophically, getting back to this whole point, when it comes to managing protected lands, sometimes the question is to hunt or not to hunt, right? How do we responsibly address the issue? Particularly, we have to remember this, that we as humans are the people who work to protect native plants and wildlife. And we are who these wildlife depend on for their livelihood. But what do we do when wildlife is the threat, such as with the white-tailed deer? So at Moose Hill, at our wildlife sanctuary in Sharon, this is a mass Audubon sanctuary there, we had a huge overrun of deer. And there was about 100 deer per acre on the sanctuary. We were trying to lower that down to about 20 per acre, which we felt was a sustainable number or carrying capacity. And we realized that might take up to 40 years. Oh, I'm sorry, we might be taking up to 40 deer per year over many years in order to accomplish that reduction. And we're still working right now on just how to approach this and how to manage it. Some other folks had thoughts about simply just putting up fences around the wildlife sanctuary to keep your deer from getting in. But if you've got a 1,000-acre wildlife sanctuary like we do at Moose Hill, that's not a very realistic alternative. So those are some examples that I wanted to share with you. Wanted to talk about dispersal and divisiveness, which is starting to flare up. And if you're reading the papers and listening to the news on the Cape, you're hearing a lot about these three species: the great white shark, which is making a big comeback on our waters; the gray seal, which I alluded to earlier, which is making a big comeback; and then eastern coyote, all of which many people have fears and concerns about. So we call it the Oz and the Jaws. They're so cute, and the Jaws, not so cute. So what are the trends as we talk about these two species, the gray seal and the great white shark? Well, seals, their population has grown tremendously, up from, I'm literally talking about 19 individuals in 1994, recorded out on Tuckernuck Island in and around Nantucket Sound, to an estimated 40,000 gray seals in 2017. And that number is likely gone up another 10,000 or so. Here we are in 22. Over 200 sharks have been tagged since 2009, and 350 have been cataloged by Greg Skomel and the Mass Division of Fisheries. And seals attract sharks. We know that. So does culling of seals make sense to help control our shark population? That is a question that's been posed. So let's talk about some of the founded or unfounded accusations or statements that we're hearing about in relation to seals and sharks specifically. So seals reduce fish stocks, true or false? Well, it depends on the lens you're looking at. You're looking at a micro level or a macro level. If you're talking about a micro level, then sure, seals can definitely have impacts on fish stocks and certain embayments around islands in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and perhaps on the micro scale in and around our waters near shore. But are seals reducing fish stocks around the world in our waters? Not in any way close to the amount that we're doing, that's certainly for sure. And it's there's no evidence that seals are having an impactful reduction in fish stocks on the broad scale, on the ocean scale. What about this? Seals increase risk for swimmers. Again, yes, of course they definitely have an impact. If you're swimming with the seals at the National Seashore, you're putting yourself at grave risk of being attacked by a great white shark. I say grave risk, it's still unlikely, of course, odds are, but who wants to be that one? Seals pollute the waters, same thing. On a very micro scale, sure, I think seals can have an impact on near shore water in certain dense areas where seals populations are very high, but are seals polluting the waters on a broader scale? No, it's an equilibrium. So what about culling sharks using baited drums? In Australia, there were attempts on the Gold Coast around Brisbane to try to lure sharks away from the beaches and away from swimmers by baiting drums several hundred meters out from water. There's been some thoughts about tactics such as this, where great white sharks are becoming a problem on beaches. Removing seals will remove the sharks. We'll just remove the seals and then you won't have the problem anymore. Well, removing the seals turns out to be a very, very difficult thing, if not a possible thing to do, because we know that as you remove seals, you just open the door for additional seals to make their way down from the source population. So what is the source population for gray seals? Well, it's up in Canada. Sable Island is basically the epicenter for the Western Atlantic gray seal population. That's the source for the seals that we see in and around our waters. And seals have been making their way down or dispersing into our waters for some time for a number of different reasons. There's basically 5 reasons, one of which is that there is a very healthy and robust source population at Sable Island that these seals can come from. 2, these seals disperse really easily. They can move long distances very, very quickly. 3, they have high reproductivity. They reproduce very easily and very quickly. And the conservation measures that have been put in place to protect gray seals have made a big difference in allowing them to make their way down to the Cape. The conservation measures have to do with the Marine Mammal Act from 1972 that prevented the culling of seals. It was the culling of seals, much like the story with the turkeys, that caused their numbers to drop. And when conservation measures were put in place, the population started to rebound. And then the advantages of the seals being an adaptive generalist has allowed them to really come back in the numbers that we're seeing today. And if you were to talk to seal experts, they'll tell you that the population now is just achieving a full recovery and that it's not an overpopulation. So what about the idea of there are plenty of sharks out there, so there's no harm in culling them? Well, we've seen a lot of evidence that the population of sharks around the world is dropping dramatically from overfishing and unethical fishing techniques. And so there really aren't, it's not fair to say that there's plenty of sharks out there and that their populations are stable. Many sharks are declining at very large numbers. And then great white sharks spend lots of their time in less than 15 feet of water on the Cape. Is that true or false? What do you think? I've learned, this is an amazing statistic. I've learned from some of the shark experts on the Cape that these great white sharks in our waters have adapted over time to utilize super shallow waters for hunting because they know that that's the best way to catch seals. When seals are hauling out of the water, the great whites can just kind of linger around and pick them off. Again, it's sort of like the buffet scenario I described with the bird feeders. You'll notice there's a lot of interconnectedness here amongst these generalists in the way they behave and the way they act. Great whites are taking advantage of the seal populations along the shorelines. They're adapting to live in shallow waters. And of course, that's where we're swimming. So it really makes sense to try to avoid the areas where there are a lot of seals. And it's also, against the law to be tampering with seals, playing with them, luring them. And a lot of people don't realize that. So I mentioned earlier the Marine Mammal Act, that's the MMA of 1972, is just now realizing its successes with the gray seals. That's what the experts will tell us. There's not an overabundance. They're just reaching a level that they were formerly at before they were culled. So any cull of seals in mass waters would quickly be replaced by the 400,000 seal population that's dispersing from Sable Island. And seals are what we call mesopredators. They're prey and they're preyed upon. And they're really integral to the food web. You also could consider them as keystone species. So seals, that's the seal story. And these are some things to think about. So let's talk and shift the story a little bit to land and talk about the eastern coyote, which is definitely a most adaptable carnivore. I'm going to show you a quick video from a game camera that we set up at Skunk Net River Sanctuary in Osterville. This is not a German Shepherd. This is a large adult male eastern coyote. And there's a fleeting glimpse. How many of you, I would ask you to raise your hands if we were in person, have seen an animal that looked like a German Shepherd in their yard passing by that really turned out to be a coyote. I'm sure many of you have. On my way home last night from Boston, about 10 o'clock, I passed two coyotes on the road, one here on Route 6A in Barnstable and one on the Mid-Cape Highway. At this time of year, coyotes are starting to become active, looking for den sites. They're pairing up, getting ready for the reproductive season. Here's an image that was captured in December of 2012 at Skunk Net River Wildlife Sanctuary again, of two coyotes moving about. So coyotes, there's a lot of myth around coyotes. There's a lot of fear of the unknown that people have with coyotes. And let's pose a couple questions for you here. Coyotes kill cats and eat them. We get a lot of calls about this. Concerned citizens wondering if their cat Fluffy is at risk if they're outdoors. Well, the answer is yes. Absolutely, your cat is at risk if it's outdoors. I'd highly recommend that you keep your cats indoors. Coyotes, while they're not actively going after cats, and while coyotes are not evolved to eat other carnivores like cats, it doesn't mean that today's coyotes that are super adaptive aren't taking opportunities to eat cats if they come across them. Very similar again to the bird analogy with the bird feeders. So there's been a lot of studies I'll tell you later that indicate that coyotes aren't, if you're looking at the feces of a coyote, it's not full of cat meat. But it doesn't mean that cats won't get taken. Coyotes hunt other carnivores, true or false? What do you all think about that? Well, I just sort of mentioned it. Coyotes have not evolved to eat other carnivores. There's reasons why carnivores don't eat other carnivores. It's mainly because of the risk of injury. Carnivores fighting against carnivores, not going to end well. Disease can be transmitted between similar species. And it's far easier for coyotes to be going after herbivores, which is the primary component of their diet, or to go after fruits and vegetables. Massachusetts has a bag limit for coyote hunting. What do you think about that? True or false? No, there is not. There is no bag limit for coyote hunting in the state of Massachusetts. That surprises a lot of people. What about this? Baiting coyotes is legal in Massachusetts. True or false? It's actually true. It is legal to bait coyotes in the state of Massachusetts. That might surprise you too. Shooting coyotes from inside your home is illegal in Massachusetts. You know what? It's actually legal. You can shoot a coyote from inside your home as long as you're within 500 feet of another neighboring house. Or if you get permission from the person who's within 500 feet of you. So in a state like Massachusetts, with the population density that we have and somewhat progressive government that we have, you would think that some of these things would be outlawed, but they're not. And it does surprise a lot of people. What about this one? Shooting coyotes will decrease their presence on Cape Cod. Well, very similar to the seal analogy, trying to cull or remove coyotes within a certain territory will not reduce the total number of coyotes or seals. It'll actually likely allow an expansion, because when coyotes are killed, the survivors reproduce at a younger age and have larger litters. And when there's a void in a particular habitat or territory, other conspecifics, we call them, other coyotes will make their way in and utilize that void in the habitat or the territory. So here's some other tidbits. We'll talk about sort of Canis latrans 101 biology. Canis latrans is the Latin name for the eastern coyote. Coyotes are monogamous, usually for several years. They breed from December through March. We're right in the heart of their breeding season now. The pups are born in April and anywhere from 1 to 12 in a litter, but usually 6. They wean within 6 to 8 weeks. They use dens for birthing and rearing, and many of the favored den locations on the Cape are edges of cranberry bogs, or ecotones, as we call them, which is that sliver of successional forest between open fields and dense forest, that edge habitat. They love the edge habitat. They begin to forage with adults at 8 to 13 weeks, the young, and then the young disperse the following fall, often really, really widely. And the story of the coyotes on the Cape is really interesting. Coyotes arrived on the Cape from the west in the 1970s. And as they made their way from the west, they started to hybridize with wolves, and in many cases, other dogs. Because if you think about it, a coyote that's making its way from the west would be passing through farmland and have many opportunities to pass through other carnivores like wolves, but also domestic dogs that might be living on these ranches and on these farms. And these coyotes that we see today, such as the one I showed you on that color image from SkunkNet, have adapted to the urban landscape very well. And you've heard stories, I'm sure, and read about coyotes in places like Brooklyn and Queens and Brockton, Massachusetts. And coyotes have adapted to living in some of the locations that we live in as well. And they're taking advantage of gardens. They're taking advantage of stray trash, dumpsters, restaurants. You'd be surprised how resourceful coyotes have become. They're certainly not the classic wily coyote that we envision from the Roadrunner cartoons that are living out in the prairie and nowhere around civilization. That's not the case anymore. And they've established large territories on Cape Cod. Some of you might have heard presentations by John Way. A lot of what I was talking about in the coyote presentation I gave several years ago that Lucy was referring to was information shared with me by John Way, who's done extensive coyote ecology research on Cape Cod, and is probably the leading resource on that. He has a website that you can learn a lot more about the urban coyote. So coyotes' diets have broadened as they've adapted to the suburban environment that we live in today. So this is a really interesting image that gives you a breakdown, sort of a relative proportion breakdown of what our eastern coyote is. Some people call the eastern coyote a coy wolf, and that's because it's a mix, as I mentioned earlier. And according to this study by Javier Monzon, who analyzed 437 eastern coyotes, about 64% of our eastern coyotes is Canis latrans, right? The coyote. 13% is gray wolf, Canis lupus. 13% is eastern wolf, and about 10% is dog. So that explains why our eastern coyotes are so big. And it also explains why they have a very tame demeanor and why they're so adaptable. So let's talk kind of what people are most concerned about, the danger factor, right? I think we do need to keep it in perspective, think pragmatically about it. 4 million dog bites per year exist in the US, not coyote or wolf, but dog, right? 800,000 of those need medical attention. 1,000 people per day go to the emergency room as a result of dog bites. On the other hand, there's been about 5 documented coyote bites in Massachusetts history. And of those, 2 or 3 were rabid coyotes. And there are 2 fatalities recorded in the history in North America in the past 500 years, right? One on a toddler in California in the early 1980s, which happened to be a food habituated animal. And then one on an 18-year-old woman in Nova Scotia in 2009. And then dog bite losses exceed $1 billion per year And that's about $345 million paid by insurance there. So when we compare coyote risk to dog risk, I think it's safe to say there's some proportionality we need to think about. So coyotes and our pets, should we fear? Well, I think it's reasonable to be very cautious about letting your pets out at night. And yes, if you are walking out on a path with your dog, you should be aware, you should be alert, and you shouldn't be doing things that are irresponsible. An urban study analyzed over 1,400 scats found that most common food items were small rodents, fruit, deer, and rabbit. And only about 2% of the scats from coyotes had human garbage, and only about 2% showed evidence of cats. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen. So these statistics are really just intended to put things in proportion for you, and so that you can take a rational and pragmatic approach to living with wildlife and understanding coyotes. There's a lot of fear of the unknown out there. So let's shift gears a little bit now to weasels, because this is another species that's moving around in our landscape. We get a lot of calls about. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen fisher. You've seen river otter, I'm sure. If you live near a river, you've probably seen mink. Mink on the lower left-hand corner is a type of weasel that's almost always associated with moving water. We see them a lot on our small rivers on the Cape. Skunks used to be considered a weasel, but they're no longer. They've been reclassified thanks to modern day genetics. And then there's the long-tailed weasel. But all these guys have certain things in common. They're mustelids. Mustela is the genus for the weasel family. And if you look at all the different types of weasels out there, right, they all have long, slender tails. They have very small, narrow heads, very tiny ears, and they're extremely flexible. These are all animals that are mousers. And the term weasel actually means in Sanskrit to have a musty smell. So these animals are adapted to going into small places, tunnels and crevices to seek out their prey. So how did the weasel cross the road? Well, it probably used a tunnel because it's so well adapted to doing so. I bring this up because a lot of issues with hit by cars of a lot of these dispersing animals. And many people ask, why is it if there's so many weasels, I'm never seeing them? Well, again, part of the reason is because they're adaptable to using these underground passageways. Culverts, for example, that are installed on roads, culverts for tidal flow and for rivers or places that weasels would like to go. And weasels are also really good at staying out of vision by making their way through densely populated neighborhoods using patches or corridors, as we call them. And what you see here is just a classic image of a suburban neighborhood that has little chunks or patches of green space associated with them. And a lot of these animals we're talking about, especially these adaptable generalists like weasels, are really adept at finding their way from point A in the neighborhood up in the left-hand corner here, all the way down to here by using these corridors. And they'll make their way through these patches really strategically, avoiding the open roads and avoiding getting hit. There's a great PBS special about urban raccoons that talks all about this. Some of you might have seen this. So here's a couple great video images that we collected with a game camera again, at Skunk Net River. Blink and you miss it. Ever playful river otters. This game camera was set up right along the Skunk Net River along a little footbridge. And those are great places to set up game cameras because if it's a bridge for humans, it's likely going to be utilized by wildlife as well. And in your backyard, if you walk along the perimeter of your lawn and just peer into the shrubs, you'll notice that there's often very small paths that just make their way underneath the shrubbery. If you were to set up a game camera there, you'd be capturing all sorts of wildlife that you didn't know existed. It's a fun exercise to do just to familiarize yourself with what's in your backyard. It's a fun pastime. You might get some really great images like these. A pair of otters, again, at the Skunk Net River Wildlife Sanctuary in mid-February, just frolicking in the snow. I'll do this one again. It's a great image. So with this bridge, we captured the footage of these two otters In the same winter, we also captured footage of a fisher. We also captured footage of the mink that I showed you earlier. And we captured some great footage of some mergansers, a white-tailed deer, a great blue heron. And it was just really fun to be able to document this stuff for the sake of promoting it to our public. These are the sorts of things that you can see if you go to our wildlife sanctuaries. So let's talk a little bit about the fisher. There's some interesting myths out there about fisher. I'm sure many of you have heard these. Fishers scream in the night. The number of calls we've gotten about this. What do you all think? Is that high-pitched scream that you're hearing in the night, that blood-curdling scream, that shriek, is that coming from a fisher or is it coming from something else? I would be willing to bet that what we're hearing is not a fisher screaming at all. It's actually a fox. And I always pose the question to folks that call and say they have video or they have audio of screaming fishers to show me evidence of a fisher, not just the audio of it, but the video of it screaming. And most people can't do that. I think the reason is because they're not. Fishers are generally not screaming in the night. They're hunting. And if you're hunting, why would you be advertising yourself by screaming? It doesn't mean that fisher can't vocalize, and they do. And I'm sure they occasionally get in fights with other fishers and they can scream. And I've heard their calls, but that high shrieking scream that we're hearing in the night, I'm almost certain is from fox. What about this? Fishers kill and eat cats. We asked this question about the coyotes. Well, just like with the coyotes, fishers are not adapted to and have not evolved to eat other carnivores, including cats. In studies that have been done on fisher scat, fisher poop, does not reveal a large proportion of other carnivore meat in there. So they generally are. They can. And I would take precaution with your pets accordingly. How about this one? Fisher are found all throughout the Cape. Yeah, they are now. They're all over the place. And we're getting all sorts of accounts from stem to stem, from the Upper Cape to the Outer Cape. Fishers hunt and kill other fishers and other carnivores. We already addressed that one. This is the historic fisher range map. If you go into an old Encyclopedia Britannica, right, and look at a classic range of the fisher, this is what it would reveal. But today, if you were to look at the same map, the actual distribution of fisher would drop way down solidly here in the West, way down into the Midwest, and all the way down into the Mid-Atlantic states. And this is just another consequence of their adaptability and dispersal ability. So look at this. This is a male fisher. Fisher are dimorphic, which means that the males and the females are very different, right? Like a cardinal is dimorphic. So this is a male fisher, and this is a female fisher. Much, much smaller. The females will den inside of hollow logs, trees. They're an arboreal species, so they live up in the trees most of their lives. And they take advantage of hollow dens in these trees to raise their young. And this is a really cool video that I got lucky enough to capture here on the Cape last winter. Of what I believe is a female fisher. And she makes her way down through this red maple tree. And as she does so, just listen to her claws. The audio may not be loud enough. You can hear an upset crow that signaled in on this. But look how adept that animal is at maneuvering down the tree. Totally at home in the trees. And you can see some of the signs of its long claws as it makes its way off the tree. It pops off a little bit of bark there. So these animals are adapted to living in trees. They do come down onto the ground, but it's not common. More often than not, you'll see a fisher in and around a forested habitat like this. That was really fun to see that. And then we captured, again, at the same bridge at Skunk Net, we captured this really great image. of a fisher that had seized a squirrel, seemed to have dropped it on the, I'll do it again. It dropped it on the bridge and was picking it up. We weren't certain whether this was really a fish or not, but we did send the video into some friends at Mass Fish and Wildlife, and they were able to confirm that it was a fisher. We thought it might have been a mink. Mink and fisher are similar in size. The female fisher are very similar in size to the mink. The male fisher are far larger, but we were able to confirm this was a fisher. And this was back in 2013 when it wasn't, an everyday occurrence or a typical occurrence to see a fisher. So we wanted to be sure that we were right before we started promoting it. I mean, if you tell me that you see a deer in your backyard, I'd have no reason to believe you. But if you say you saw a bobcat or a fisher, they're not that common yet. We'd want a little bit of evidence. All right, let's shift a little bit here. This is the second to last chapter here. We're now at, we're at 8 o'clock. So we'll do one last chapter here and then we'll wrap it up for questions. I want to bring this up because it is now a coastal waterbird busy season for Mass Audubon. Our coastal waterbird program is dealing with piping plovers and other endangered shorebirds. And one of the biggest challenges they're facing is the encroachment of these generalists taking advantage of the whole huge abundance of piping plovers on our beaches. What's been happening is piping plovers are utilizing ever smaller and smaller sections of beach because that's what's afforded to them. We may not be allowing plovers to have the same range on the beaches that we once did for a number of different reasons, and they're being concentrated into small areas. So when a predator like a crow or a coyote makes its way onto a coastal waterbird beach where there's piping plovers, they're apt to find the whole kit and caboodle. They may find a treasure trove of plovers all densely packed into a small section of beach. It may be the same case with our terns. The number of breeding pairs and the productivity in Massachusetts is represented on this graph here. And the red is representing the number of chicks that are fledged, and the blue is representing the number of pairs. And as you can see, the number of pairs keeps going up over time, which is wonderful. But the challenge for these species is that the offspring are having a difficult time surviving all of the predators that we're seeing. And so if you look at all the causes of piping plover nest loss across the state and across Massachusetts, and across Cape Cod in particular, you'll see that predation leads the way by far amongst all of the causes of nest loss. And if you look at all the predators that are causing issues for piping plovers, it's the coyote and the avian predators that are having the biggest impact, while there's others such as mammals and red fox and a variety of unknown creatures that are also having an impact too. So let's go to the main takeaway here, managing wildlife today. We talked about the specialists, which are dependent on us, such as the piping plovers. And then we talked about the generalists, which are taking advantage of us, like all the other species I mentioned. And it's really up to us as concerned citizens and as wildlife managers to strike a balance, a pragmatic balance when it comes to managing these species and understanding that we have a lot of responsibility now to act on behalf of these rare species, such as piping plovers. And I'm going to skip over this section and go to the last slide here, which is some hope. We've gotten 2 summers ago, the first confirmed bald eagle nest on Cape Cod in over 115 years. That was really exciting. It was in Marston's Mills. And some of you might have read about it in the papers. The story of the bald eagle is a really great one, similar to the turkeys I was telling you about. There was a huge reintroduction effort that took place in the 1980s at the Quabbin Reservoir out in Western Mass. That resulted in 25 pairs of bald eagles in the state of Massachusetts by 2010. And today, or as of 2020 anyways, there were 80 nests across the state. And here on the Cape, we were the last region to be colonized by the bald eagle. And the irony is that Cape Cod was really the last stronghold for eagles before they were nearly extirpated due to DDT back in the 1970s. So keep your eyes to the sky for bald eagles. I think there's a really good chance we're going to have another breeding pair here this summer. And then the next chapter, I think it's worth keeping your eyes out for not only bald eagles, but for bobcat, which have also been documented on the Cape. And hey, who knows, maybe porcupines. And another chapter for another day is to talk about osprey and how their numbers have completely boomed here on the Cape Cod and some of the challenges that we're facing with osprey. And some of the work that we're now conducting with Eversource, and many of you living in Falmouth are now well aware of this, right? There's been a proactive effort amongst the Conservation Commission and concerned residents in the town to work with Eversource to try to solve some of the challenges that these ospreys are having when it comes to nesting on utility poles. And this is really encouraging because for years we've felt as though we're not getting responses from Eversource that we're hoping for, but they have come around and realized that it's really in their best interest to be acting proactively to try to manage these unwanted utility pole nests and avoid some of the electrocutions and some of the unwanted problems that we're having with ospreys in and around Falmouth. So let's open it up to some questions. I wish we could have done this all along and made this more interactive, but let's go and take a look. Lucy, I don't know if do you want to ask some of the questions and so everyone can hear them, or should I do it? Oh, here's a question. When you talk about coyotes, can you also discuss coy wolf hybrids? Do we have those on Cape? Yeah, I touched a little bit on this. There's a bit of a semantics going on, I think, here when we're talking about coy wolf and coyote. And I don't think the science is completely aligned yet with regards to proper terminology and exactly what these eastern coyotes are. But every year that we do more work, we're learning more about the genetics of these animals. I think it's safe to say, call them what you will. We know that the coyotes that we're seeing on the Cape are definitely mixed with wolves and dogs.
One of the questions I have, Ian, is about bobcats.
Oh, right.
How prolific are they? How many are on the Cape and where? I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah,
I really don't have an idea how many there are. I would suspect that there's probably multiple pairs. And there's probably a lot of young males that are moving around. So like coyotes and a lot of other animals, the younger males are the ones that are out dispersing, looking for new territories and exploring. Females tend to do a little less of that. So I know that there have been confirmed bobcat out of the National Seashore. It was confirmed through fecal analysis, and that was last year. I know there was a confirmed bobcat in Falmouth because it made the cover of the Cape Cod Times and was vetted by Fish and Wildlife staff. And like the weasels, the bobcats are really, really secretive and are very good at staying out of eyes way. There was a claim of a bobcat at Long Pasture last year. A fellow came to me and of course I asked him, do you have a photograph? He said no. He took me out to the site at the sanctuary where he saw the animal, made a pretty convincing case. I set up some game cameras in hopes I could get a glimpse of it, but I never did. So I don't have a really good sense as to how many there are.
Interesting. There was a chat question. How did the coyotes get to the Cape?
Oh, right. How did they get literally to the Cape? Yeah. So I talked generally about how they made their way from the west as western coyotes and they interbred along the way with wolves and coyotes. But the way that they get to the Cape is, yes, they can swim. And there's evidence of this by folks that live out in the Elizabeth Islands. They talk about coyotes island hopping. Sometimes they're just making their way out, dispersing to see what resources they can find on the Elizabeth Islands. And they can swim easily, just like your dog can, short distances. So whether or not every coyote that tries to get across Woods Hole makes it and doesn't get swept out and become listless and die in the water is not known. But all it takes is just a few coyotes, of course, over the course of a long period of time to colonize a new population. So we know coyotes could probably swim as far as Martha's Vineyard.
Wow.
In Falmouth as well.
Wow. Well, I've seen the deer swimming across.
I know,
Yeah,
the
that's
deer.
amazing. With
They're
their
amazing
antlers.
swimmers too.
Yeah. Cool.
Ian,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if you tried to look for the sea eagle.
Oh, right. Yeah. So several colleagues did. Stellar sea eagle. I didn't try to look for it. That's a cool story. And that's an absolute fluke. From what I understand, that bird had no business making it all the way here from Japan. And it was just a miracle that it got as far as it did. Presumably it flew over the pole and made its way down through the Canadian provinces and into Maine before making a quick foray down to Somerset. I think it made its way as far south as Somerset, Mass, and then kind of beelined it, took a U-turn and went back up into Maine. And I'm pretty confident that if it was still around, at least coastal Maine, there would have been reports of it. I'm not checking eBird regularly, but I have a suspicion that the bird has made it into the depths of Canada or somewhere up away from people, and that's why we don't know where it is anymore.
I
That was
also have
amazing.
an observation about, and I've talked to you about this before,
Yeah.
the decline of raccoons in skunks. They used to be fairly rampant and popular in our neighborhood, but they're not around now.
But there's always these ebbs and flows of micro populations. You know, it depends on resources availability, all sorts of other factors that we can't know about. It's really hard to know. People make comments about birds that seem to be in decline. Without having someone do a conscientious study, it's really hard to know exactly what's happening with these populations on a small scale. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah. And let's see, do we have any other questions from the audience?
You can always email in or call me anytime, and I love to answer questions, and I love to engage in this sort of stuff. It's so timely and it's so current, and it's wonderful that all of you guys care enough to listen to this, and I just encourage you to get out and explore as many of your wild places and to nature as best you can. It's so rewarding and so healthful.
But I think it's like Susanna has a question.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead, Susanna.
Are you typing?
You can go ahead and ask it.
You can ask
you're
it.
muted.
You can
Unmute
ask
yourself and then you can ask the question.
What's involved in setting up these cameras that
Oh, the
you
game
have?
cameras. Oh, it's really simple. You can go online and find these for as little as $150. Just check a real quick Google search. It's you can buy cameras that have both a video and a still capability, or you can get a cheaper model that's just a still capability. But you'd want to mount it in such a way that there aren't a lot of obstructions like blowing branches in front of it, because that will trigger the sensor and it'll be going off and you'll be getting hundreds and hundreds of images of blowing trees. So try to situate it in a place that's low to the ground, away from vegetation. And like I mentioned earlier, go out into your yard. Just start by setting one up in your yard. Just kind of get down and crawl around in areas of the yard where you can see down below the shrubs, and just look for very narrow paths. It doesn't have to be much of a path, and you'd be surprised what uses it. Even deer can get through the narrowest of openings. And I can promise you, you'll get a lot of raccoon, you'll get deer, you'll get turkey, you'll get skunk, you'll get possum, but you might get fisher, you might get bobcat, and all sorts of other surprises. It's fun. It's a fun way to document the use of your yard. It's fun to document the phenology that we were talking about, when animals are active, what time of year. We've gotten some great images that have to do with phenology of otter by putting up cameras regularly year in and year out at Long Pasture and capturing their denning. It's fun.
Cool. Susanna did type her question into the
Oh,
chat.
she did.
She wants to know about eagle nests. How many bald eagle nests there are on the Cape, and where are they? I think the where is, we're trying to keep
Right.
that secret, aren't we?
Yeah, because unanticipated consequences of too many people knowing about these things. There was The one I mentioned at the end of the presentation was in Marston's Mills. And in 2020, not last summer, but the summer before, that was the first time in 115 years of an eagle nest documented on Cape Cod. And why is it? It's because the eagles are slowly dispersing from the mainland of Massachusetts onto the Cape, and they're finding suitable habitat. So there's only one, and it was a successful nest. It fledged several chicks in 2020. Last year, the same nest didn't fledge any chicks.
Wow.
So it's possible that that pair got disoriented, separated, one of them passed. Who knows what happened, but I think there's a good chance that that'll be back again. But in the state of Massachusetts, there's many eagle nests, and we'll see many more because they're just so adaptable.
Great. And then I think we'll call this one the last question. What is the impact of last year's drought on, oops, where can I see the rest of the question? There it is, on vernal pools and amphibians?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a good question.
Well, the amphibians and vernal pools have adapted to living in these temporary wetlands that dry up regularly. And it's par for the course for them. They're basically, every year that they're breeding in a vernal pool, it's a race against time to get their young out. And these amphibians have adapted this trade-off because they know that pools that hold water longer generally have fish, and fish will absolutely kill all of their babies, whereas drying may or may not. And on any given year, it might be a fruitful year and every single egg hatches and metamorphs. And on other years, every single one might become fertilizer. So it's an evolutionary trade-off that these animals have been through. So last summer, when it was very, very dry, most of the vernal pools didn't yield any reproduction. These animals reproduce many, many years over, sometimes 10, 15 years, or in the case of some species like spadefoot toads, maybe 40 years is their life. So they'll just go right back at it next year and they'll hope for better next year. So it doesn't have a long-term impact.
And then
Well,
one
it
more
was really
comment.
awesome, everybody.
Yeah, one more comment. We saw
Oh,
a
sure.
ball from Clark. We saw a bald eagle flying over Coonamessett Pond last year,
Cool.
last fall, looks like.
Yeah.
That's pretty.
That's awesome. So it's not unusual to see bald eagles flying over the Cape, spending time here, hunting here, and basically spending portions of their lives. That's not unusual. What's unusual is an active, successful nest. That's what we haven't seen in 115 years, just to make that discrepancy. Eagles are here all the time. It's just, they're not a breeding bird on Cape Cod, as we like to say.
Well, hopefully that'll be changing.
It's changing. It is. Yeah. Keep your eye to the sky for eagles. There'll be a lot more.
Okay.
Thanks for spending time with me. It was fun to do this. And feel
Thank
free
you
to
so much,
call or
Ian.
holler, and
Really
we
appreciate
can
it.
talk more.
Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Happy spring. Take care.
Happy
Here's to
spring.
some warm days ahead and sunshine.
Oh yeah, they're coming.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you all.
Thank you so much.
You're my pleasure. I had a good time. We'll catch up.
Yeah, it's so great to
Okay.
see you. Maybe I'll catch you out on the trails one of these
I
days.
know. Let's do it.
Okay, all
I'm gonna
right.
go past you. You gotta take a walk here.
Yeah, I would love that. I would actually love
You
that.
should.
All
Okay.
right, see ya. Good night, everybody.